Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a fascinating what-if from history that almost happened. We all know about the Spanish-American War in 1898. The US intervened, "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry, and Spain's centuries-old empire crumbled. The US walked away with the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. But what about Cuba, the island that was the very spark for the war? Why didn't the United States just annex it and make it another territory, or even a state? It seems like the obvious move, right? Well, the story is far more complex and revealing than you might think. Let's unravel why Cuba remained, at least officially, independent. First, we need to understand the official reason the US went to war. Publicly, this was a war of liberation. For years, Americans had been horrified by reports coming out of Cuba. Spanish General Valeriano Weyler, nicknamed the Butcher, had implemented a brutal reconcentration policy, forcing hundreds of thousands of Cuban civilians into fortified camps to separate them from the rebels. Disease and starvation were rampant. The Yellow Press, led by giants like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, sensationalized these atrocities, painting a picture of a heroic Cuban people fighting for freedom against a tyrannical Spanish monarchy. So when the US declared war, it wasn't framed as a land grab. It was a noble crusade to free the oppressed. This public sentiment was so strong that it was actually written into the war declaration itself. Before a single shot was fired, Congress passed the Teller Amendment. This was a crucial piece of legislation. It explicitly stated that the United States had no intention of exercising sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over Cuba, except for its pacification, and that once Spain was defeated, the US would leave the government and control of the island to its people. This was a promise made to the American public and the world. To turn around immediately after the war and annex Cuba would have been a massive act of hypocrisy, undermining the entire moral justification for the conflict. It would have made the US look just like the old European colonial powers it claimed to be different from. But let's be real, politics is never that simple. While the public was motivated by humanitarian concerns, many powerful figures in Washington had other ideas. The idea of annexing Cuba was incredibly popular among a group known as the imperialists. People like Theodore Roosevelt, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan believed it was America's manifest destiny to expand its influence across the globe. For them, Cuba was a strategic gem. It was the pearl of the Antilles, commanding the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico and the future site of the Panama Canal. A naval base in Cuba, like the one they would eventually get at Guantanamo Bay, was seen as essential for projecting American power in the Caribbean and beyond. Annexation seemed like the logical next step in America's rise to a global superpower. So if the imperialists wanted it, why didn't it happen? Well, they faced a powerful and diverse opposition. First, you had the anti-imperialists. This wasn't just a fringe group. It included prominent figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and former President Grover Cleveland. They argued that building an overseas empire was fundamentally un-American. The United States was founded on principles of self-determination and government by the consent of the governed, as laid out in the Declaration of Independence. How could they justify ruling over another people against their will? They saw imperialism as a betrayal of America's core values, a path that would lead to moral corruption and endless foreign conflicts. Their arguments resonated with a large portion of the American public who were wary of foreign entanglements. Then there was the economic argument, which cut both ways. Yes, some American businesses, particularly the sugar industry, had massive investments in Cuba and saw annexation as a way to secure their assets and create a stable business environment. They dreamed of tariff-free Cuban sugar flooding the American market. But this was a nightmare for other American producers. The domestic sugar beet and sugarcane growers in states like Louisiana and Colorado were terrified of competing with cheap Cuban sugar. They formed a powerful lobby and argued fiercely against annexation, fearing it would ruin their businesses. This economic tug-of-war created a stalemate, making a clean annexation politically difficult. And let's not forget one of the most significant and frankly ugly reasons: race. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States was a deeply segregated society. The recent Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case had just enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal. Many politicians, particularly from the South, were horrified by the idea of incorporating an island with a large Afro-Cuban and mixed-race population into the United States. They openly worried about how to govern a territory that wasn't majority white, and the prospect of someday granting statehood and congressional representation to its non-white population. These racist anxieties were a powerful, if often unspoken, barrier to annexation. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we have to consider the Cubans themselves. The Cuban people had been fighting for their independence from Spain for decades, long before the US ever got involved. Leaders like José Martí, Antonio Maceo, and Máximo Gómez were national heroes who had sacrificed everything for the dream of a free Cuba Libre. They weren't fighting to trade one colonial master for another. When the war ended, Cuban rebels controlled large parts of the countryside. Annexing the island would have meant fighting a new, bloody war, not against a weakened Spain, but against a battle-hardened Cuban independence army on their home turf. The US was already getting bogged down in a brutal insurgency in the Philippines, and the prospect of opening a second front in Cuba was deeply unappealing. The cost in both blood and treasure would have been immense, so instead of annexation, the United States came up with a compromise, a solution that gave them control without the full responsibility of ownership. This was the Platt Amendment of 1901. After a few years of military occupation, the US told the Cubans they could have their independence, but only if they wrote this amendment into their new constitution. The Platt Amendment was a leash. It gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it felt its interests were threatened. It limited Cuba's ability to make treaties with other countries. And crucially, it granted the US the right to lease land for naval bases, which is how the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base was established and why it still exists today. In essence, the Platt Amendment turned Cuba into a US protectorate. Cuba was independent in name, but its sovereignty was severely limited. The US could enjoy the strategic and economic benefits of controlling the island without the political headaches of annexation. No need to deal with domestic sugar lobbyists, anti-imperialist arguments, racial anxieties, or a full-blown Cuban insurgency. It was the ultimate have your cake and eat it too solution. This arrangement lasted for over 30 years until the amendment was abrogated in 1934, though American influence in Cuba remained powerful for decades to come. So, to answer our initial question, why didn't the US annex Cuba? It was a perfect storm of factors. The public promise of the Teller Amendment, fierce opposition from anti-imperialists, economic infighting, widespread racial prejudice, and the very real threat of a long, costly war against the Cuban people themselves. Together, these forces pushed the US away from outright colonization and towards a more indirect, but still very effective form of control. It is a powerful reminder that history is rarely a simple story of a powerful nation doing whatever it wants. It's a messy, complicated process shaped by ideals, greed, fear, and the undeniable will of people to be free. Thanks so much for watching. What do you think? Should the US have annexed Cuba, or was this arrangement the best possible outcome? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another video. See you next time.